Hey guys, welcome back. I'm going to take you into my classroom right now. I want to talk to cyclists, runners, swimmers to a certain degree, anyone who's more involved in endurance sports right now. Soccer players, you can also apply this in other field sports that require a lot of running, but not necessarily sprinting. So we're going to talk about the burn. Now, I'm a cyclist, so I'm going to put it to you in cycling terms. So, when you get to that point that happens sometimes where you bonk. That's the term we use. In running, you use the term hit the wall. It's where it's a burning in your legs. This is how I feel it anyway. It's a burning in your legs to the degree that you just can barely push the pedals anymore. It's like trying to pedal through quicksand. And that happens sometimes more often than we like. But I want to talk to you about a little bit, and don't be afraid of some of these terms. I'm going to break them down in some easier language. But I want you to understand why it's happening, because if you understand why it's happening, then we can understand how to prevent it. And when I do my nutrition class, which I hope a lot of you can come to if you're cyclists or runners, I'm going to talk to you more about the specifics of how to prevent this. So let's take a look here. All right. So the burning, first of all, is a fatigue. It's muscle fatigue. It's one of the big things that's happening. So this term ATP, adenine triphosphate, and it is it's your energy. ATP equals energy. So it's what makes your body work. It's what causes cellular functions to happen in your body constantly. It's what we need when we exercise as well. Everything runs on ATP. ATP is formed by, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, what we feed ourselves. Particularly carbohydrates are the biggest source for refueling our ATP. So when ATP gets low, we have a certain amount we store in our muscles, but when it gets low, that's when you start to feel that burning sensation. That's one of the reasons, because we can't deplete it, because our bodies, like I said, we need it for cellular function, so we won't completely deplete it. Another thing I'm going to talk to you about is glucose. Glucose is what gives you energy. It's what helps to create this ATP. Particularly glucose. When you think of glucose, think carbohydrates. Because carbohydrates, they are the main source of our glucose, main source of our energy. We convert those carbohydrates to ATP to give us energy for what we're doing. So that is all part of the process of metabolism. And we're going to talk about the speed of metabolism. So let's start there, speed of metabolism. So you're out on a bike ride, right? Let's say you're doing a long bike ride, and what's happening as you're turning those pedals and, chatting with your friends or whatever, and then you're going longer, or you start going faster, or the elevation rises and it's requiring more energy. It's requiring more ATP for your muscles. So think of ATP as what your muscles need in order to work a little bit harder and to push through like harder pace or longer distance or whatever it may be. So when metabolism happens, your muscles are pulling the ATP that's already stored in the muscle, because we can store some, or it's pulling in what you're eating. So when you're intaking carbohydrates, it's going to use those for fuel. But you have the time it takes for it to get into the bloodstream, to get broken down and converted to ATP, which is really fast overall. But still, when you need that energy instantly, it still takes time. So metabolism speed is important. Now, really quickly. So you have metabolism speed. You have a couple different speeds you can use. So when we think of like efforts that are really, think about an effort that's really hard, like a big sprint, whether you're on a bike, on a running or whatever. If you're sprinting all out, you can only go for like 10 seconds or whatever it may be, depending on how fast your speed is. And that's because that's when you're requiring a lot of muscle recruitment, your body can only produce so much ATP without requiring extra oxygen. And we're going to talk about the oxygen needs too. So backing up to our bike rider, you're doing a long ride, maybe riding for a couple hours or whatever, and you're trying to push your pace some, or you're going up a mountain or whatever it may be. The metabolism, so you're not going to be able to sprint for very long because you would need more oxygen. And then you're not going to be able, so when you get to the point that you need more oxygen, how do we get the oxygen? Well, we breathe it in, right? And so this is why when you breathe in more oxygen, you're going to go to what we call the oxidative system. So endurance runners, if you're going for more than what we'd say, like a half hour or more, you're getting into the endurance phase of things. And so your body's going to start requiring oxygen in order to push and produce ATP. So let's get back. So we're on our bike, starting to feel that burn, that fatigue. What's happening? Well, there's only a couple possibilities of what's happening. First of all, your muscles are trying to regenerate ATP, and they're not getting enough oxygen. So, so you need a little bit. So you need to be able to push back, be able to intake more oxygen, and get it delivered to the working muscles, because it takes a while to get the oxygen in, get it in the bloodstream, and get it to the muscles that are working, because it's going to deliver it all over. But we want to get it to, our legs if we're a cyclist, and definitely to our lungs too. The other thing is what we talked about with metabolism, carbohydrates. If you aren't intaking enough carbohydrates, then what's going to happen is you're biking, and you start to get that fatigue and that burning, and you just, no matter how hard you push it, you just are barely moving along. You can barely turn the pedals. Well, let's say your heart rate's kind of low, and so you're getting enough oxygen, but you still can't do it. Well, the other option is that you haven't fed yourself enough, or you haven't fed yourself enough carbohydrate. So we have to be able to feed ourselves the right things. So getting those carbs in, when you're, and speaking specifically to endurance sports right now, you have to feed yourself enough carbohydrates. And you also have to have an adequate oxygen supply. So, and I'll get into specifics at our nutrition class about what kinds of carbohydrates you need, and why we prefer carbs over fats for immediate energy. That's what I'm looking at. But let me go past that. So number one, prevent the burn. Carbs. You need your carbs. You need to make sure you're supplying your body with fuel. Number two, and really quickly before I move to number two, muscle storage. I glazed over that really fast, but you do have a certain amount of ATP stored in your muscles, a certain amount of glycogen stored in your muscles, which is basically glucose converted. But you only have a little bit, so you're not going to have enough to supply the energy you need for like hours of biking or whatever it may be. Excuse me. But so feed yourself. Number two, you're biking really hard, you're running really fast or whatever, you're starting to get the burn, or maybe you're finding it harder to breathe and you're breathing really hard. We all get that feeling sometimes. I'm getting that a lot right now because I neglected my trainer over the winter, and so now I'm hitting the roads on my bike and my lungs are out of shape. So that's oxygen. Now, oxygen is needed for metabolism. So we get those, itchy nose. So we get those carbs in our body. To convert them to ATP, there's a couple different ways. The sprinter way, where you do like 10 seconds really, really fast. That does not require oxygen, and that's called anaerobic. Anaerobic, no oxygen. But you can only sustain it for a very, very small amount of time, about 10 seconds. Now, if you have a little bit of oxygen, but you're still going hard, you can sustain that pace for a couple minutes, like two to 3 minutes. When that only requires a little bit of oxygen. And then we get to the point where we want to get to a pace on our bikes, running, whatever it may be, that we can maintain a good speed without the burn, without hitting the wall, going in the red, bonking, whatever you want to call it. We want to find a speed we can maintain that, but still so we're still regenerating enough ATP, enough energy to keep that consistent speed or to keep that consistent power output. And that's where oxygen comes into play. And that's where you hear about people increasing their VO2 max, their lactate threshold, things like that. Because, what lactate does, when you talk about lactate threshold, what lactate does is it acts as a buffer. So when we get too much hydrogen in our muscles, they are what makes your muscles burn. And lactate, when you get enough lactate, holds on to that so that we don't get the burn. Now, when we get too much lactate, we get too much hydrogen. We don't have enough lactate for the hydrogen. That's when you get into the burn, and that gets a little bit more scientific. So, let's stick with a VO2 max talk here. So, backing up, lactate threshold, VO2 max, they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. But when people talk about your VO2 max, they're talking about the most amount of oxygen that you can, your maximal oxygen uptake. So the most amount you can get. And so what we want to do, the more oxygen you can get in, obviously, the better your energy supply, the faster you're going to be able to go, the longer you're going to be able to make it, because the oxidative system that uses oxygen to recreate ATP is the best system. That's what we run on all the time. That's what our body likes to run on. And you can use fat as a fuel when you're in that oxidative system. And so we have lots of backup fat. So that's always nice. So increasing your VO2 max will also increase your ATP stores. So as your body gets a little bit more used to pushing at a higher level, so when you're consistently like pushing your heart rate higher, this is how I judge it, is by my heart rate. So I know if I'm pushing into the 170s or so, that I can maintain that. That's really close to my threshold. That's really close to about as hard as I can breathe and work my muscles and still be able to regenerate that ATP at the rate I need to. If I go higher than like the lower 170s, I'm getting above my lactate threshold. Now, if I get above my lactate threshold, I'm breathing harder because my body's trying to get more oxygen, because it's like, I can't regenerate this ATP fast enough. I need more oxygen. So I'm breathing really hard like that. So if I get above those 170s, if I get near 180, that's when I'm getting that huffy puffy, and I'm trying to get more oxygen. I'm not getting it fast enough. And also that's when the muscles start to burn, because when you don't get enough oxygen to the muscles, the hydrogen builds up. And when the hydrogen builds up, we get burning. So what we want oxygen. We want to get oxygen to the muscles. The great thing is you can train your body. You can train your body and train it to intake oxygen at a better rate when you're working harder. So basically that's where we hear about intervals and sprinting and things like that, where you're working at higher than your body can handle. So, my heart rate in the 170s is like right on the borderline, but sometimes I want to work in the 180s maybe, or around 180 or upper 170. So I'm just above, and I'm going to maintain that as long as I can. And then when I start to feel like I can't hardly breathe, or I feel my muscles start to burn some, I bring it back down to slightly below, and then kind of let my oxidative system recover, get some oxygen, and then I go anaerobic again. And I push a little bit higher. And then I get to that point where huffing and puffing, huffing and puffing, huffing and puffing, and muscles starting to get burned. And I know what's happening then. I'm not getting enough oxygen, too many hydrogen ions in my muscle. I'm gonna get close to the wall, so I bring it back down. So when we do that over and unders, a lot of you might know them as over under or intervals or whatever. There's so many different terms, so many different ways to do it. But when we do that, when we practice those, we teach our bodies to work at a higher level. So then what will eventually happen is I'll get to the point where, okay, high 170s I can maintain for a longer period of time. And then I have to drop it back down. And then what we'll do is in other videos, I'll show you how to apply that to power and to strength. So right now we're talking about metabolism and we're talking about metabolism and oxygen. So we're talking about carbs and oxygen basically, and how we can use that in our endurance sports to back off the fatigue and to not get the bonk or the wall or whatever. So hopefully this made a little bit of sense. All right. I'm going to sum it up one more time, and then hopefully next week sometime I'll be able to come back to you guys and do a little talk about power and what it means to add more power to your sport. And then don't forget April 22nd, if you would like to come. It's free. Anybody can come. You can ask me questions or whatever. And we'll talk about nutrition for cyclists and for runners, for endurance sports, and how we can keep on top of that nutrition so we don't get in the burn, so we don't completely lose all of our energy, because oxygen and metabolism go hand in hand. Together they help endurance sports. You need oxygen, you need carbs. So once again, ATP, that's the energy. That's what runs your body. That's what gives you energy. So just think ATP, energy. Glucose, another word for like a sugar. Most of our glucose is carbohydrates. And so we want carbohydrates in our body. We want to be able to utilize them. I know you want your body to use more fat than carbohydrate, but it will use some fat, but it doesn't give you immediate energy. And so carbohydrates, when you're riding, when you're working, that's what you want to have. Metabolism, remember, that's just how we use the carbs, the protein, the fats. That's how we use them to create energy. So you think of everything I eat, how I use it to create energy to keep my body going. Muscle storage, remember that you have some amounts of energy stored in your muscles, all of your muscles. But it's not going to be enough to sustain you for an entire bike ride, run, whatever you're doing. Oxygen, you have to have oxygen. Our body runs on the oxidative system. It requires oxygen. When we're pushing at a higher level and we're trying to ride our bikes or run or whatever for a long period of time, we're going to have to utilize that oxidative system. You cannot be anaerobic for more than like 2 minutes. Is the max, and that's even with limited amounts of oxygen. So you have to intake more oxygen. The better your intake is, the less chance you're going to have a burnout and fatigue. So carbs, oxygen, and then that should help you avoid the dreaded bonk. All right, guys, thank you for joining me. We'll be back in the classroom again, hopefully next week or in a couple weeks. Thank you. Have a good day, guys.